finances, we worry about our careers, we worry about the stock market.
Dr. Tony Evans talks about how to deal with the things that bring on anxiety.
An eternal perspective, being rich toward God, will blow your mind and lift your worry.
This is The Alternative with Dr. Tony Evans, author, speaker, senior pastor of Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship in Dallas, Texas, and president of the Urban Alternative. We can't control the future or even see the future, but that doesn't stop us from worrying about it. Well, that's a habit we can stop, and Dr. Evans will tell us today how we can do that. Have your Bible open to Luke chapter 12 as we join him.
Most of us know what a gold digger is. A gold digger is referred to as a traditionally younger lady who seeks to go after an older man in order to get financial security. The older man, because he wants to be young, acquiesces to her charm and offers that security. Both are playing each other for the benefit that one can give the other. God has some gold-digging kids who don't want a relationship, they just want his stuff. They don't want a real relationship, they just want the goodies he can provide. And so they'll play the part. They'll look the part, they'll go to church, they'll carry a Bible when actually they're spiritual gold diggers. God, the only thing I can really use you for is for my blessing. You take away my blessing and I really don't need the relationship at all. Jesus tell a story to the crowd. A story about a man who wanted Jesus to redistribute the wealth so that this man could get an inheritance from his brother. Jesus then tells him the parable in verses 13 through 21 of Luke about a rich man who had gathered all of his profits together in order to retire early and enjoy the good life from his business success, only to hear the words, "You fool, tonight your soul is required of you. And now who will own what you have accumulated?" Then Jesus broadens the application and says, so is everybody. This doesn't just apply to the person I was talking to or the rich man I was talking about. It applies to everybody who is. So is the man or the woman who pursues treasures in this life and is poor toward God. Have no wealth in heaven while they seek to accumulate wealth in this life or the things that wealth can provide. Now, beginning in verse 22, Jesus knows that the disciples are listening to what he's told the crowd. And he knows what they are thinking. He knows they're thinking, now wait a minute, let's get practical. Jesus, I have to live in the nasty here and now, and you telling me to focus on the sweet by and by. I've got to go to work. I've got to feed my family. I've got to take care of my business. Come on, Jesus. Let's get practical. Life is real and life is hard, and you coming up with this heavenly perspective stuff. Be rich toward God. When I've got to live with my 2 feet on the ground where real people live and real problems exist. So sometimes, Jesus, this God stuff, heaven stuff, eternal focus stuff seems a bit pie in the sky and not really related to my daily existence now. He knew they were thinking that. He knew you were thinking that, so he told me, preach this. It says, he said in verse 22 to his disciples. So now Jesus has turned from the crowd to his followers. He's now not talking to the masses anymore. He's told them the story. He wants to apply it to his followers. So what he's about to say in verse 22 through 34, he wants his people to hear, those who claim him, those who claim to follow him. And his message is very simple. and so is mine. He repeats his message over and over and over again. And his message is, if you decide to live your earthly life with an eternal perspective, don't worry. Don't worry. Look at what he says in the middle of verse 22. Do not worry about your life. Look at what he says in verse 25. And which of you, by worrying, can add an hour to his life? Look at what he says in verse 26. Why do you worry about other matters? Look at what he says in verse 29. And do not keep worrying. And then look at what he says in verse 32. He calls on worry's cousin and says, do not be afraid. His message is, don't worry. I know what I just told you, disciples, shook you up a little bit because I told you to be rich up there. And I'm telling you now, if you're rich up there, you won't have to worry down here. That the antidote to worry is a heavenly perspective. Now, there is a lot in our world to worry about. We worry about our finances. We worry about our careers. We worry about our health. We worry about our age. We worry about terrorism. We worry about the stock market. We worry. And there is much to worry about in terms of what is happening in the world in which we live. And yet Jesus has the audacity to come on the scene and to tell you and me, for this is written to his disciples in verse 22, stop it. Quit it. Don't worry. You know, worry has become a major medical issue. It's got sophisticated names. Obsessive compulsive disorder. Panic disorder. Post-traumatic stress. Phobias of various kind. Height. Close quarters. And while we seek to mask it, it shows up all kinds of ways. And Jesus has the audacity to say to you and me, his disciples, stop it. What is this thing called worry? Worry has to do with a monster crawling in your mind that won't let you rest. It is painful preoccupation of what might be happening to you. Worry is concern gone haywire. Concern is one thing, worry is another. Worry is concern that's controlling you. Concern you control. Worry controls you. It keeps you up. It keeps you from resting. It keeps you stressed out. It keeps you frustrated. And yet Jesus has the audacity to offer you and me a medication for worry that has nothing to do with the pharmacy. It has everything to do with the perspective. So today, if you will hear what God says, you should feel by the time we have concluded a weight rising off of you if you are here today and are worried. Because Jesus says that a heavenly perspective is the antidote to worry, and he will give you reassurance, as he did them, of that fact. Worry can be consuming. It's like the man who said, I'll give somebody $1,000 if they will do my worrying for me. His friend said, well, I'll do your worrying for you for $1,000. The man said, well, where's my $1,000? The other man said, well, that's the first thing you need to worry about. Another man said, I got so much to worry about, I can't even get around to my next worry for 2 weeks because it just keeps coming and keeps coming. And yet, as you've already seen, Jesus says, stop it, stop it, stop it, stop it. Don't do it. And that seems kind of odd because most of the time when we are worried, we don't feel like we can control it. Because it's whatever the thing is we're worried about just won't go away. It won't disappear. And so we wind up being worried when we don't even want to worry. So God is commanding you to do something that sometimes it doesn't feel like you can not do, even if you want to not do it. And yet he gives you a prescription, a prescription for it. For this monster crawling around in our minds called worry. So let's see how this thing works. How an eternal perspective calms your earthly concerns. He says in verse 23, the reason you should not worry is life is more than food and the body is more than clothing. Life is more than food and the body is more than clothing. Let me put it another way. We worry about the wrong thing. Life is more than food. We worry about whether we're going to eat. If you really want to worry about something, worry about whether you're going to be alive, because if you're dead, eating is inconsequential. Am I going to have food? No, the question is, are you going to get up? Because life is more important than food. But we tend not to worry about whether we're going to wake up. We worry about whether we're going to have the money to buy the food. He says, you're worrying about the lesser thing. The body is more than clothing. If you don't have a body that's working, you can't put on a shirt, pants, dress. The clothing is secondary to having the body to put it on that's alive and functioning. So if you just have to worry about the bigger thing, not the lesser thing. He says that life is greater than food and your body is greater than the clothes you put on. So if you just got to worry about something big, not something secondary. So he shifts our perspective about the priorities in life.
Dr. Evans will come back in just a moment to give us an even sharper focus on those priorities. Right now, though, he's here with this thought for us.
You know, radio is the bread and butter of this ministry. If God is using our message to enhance you, to grow you, and to deepen you with him, would you remember the ministry of the Urban Alternative? You know, salvation is free, but ministry costs. It costs us to do what we do with staff and equipment and material and time and all of that. And so would you come alongside of us so that we can keep the word of God in your life? God bless you.
Staying on the radio is our largest expense here at the Urban Alternative. And it's only because of faithful friends like you that we're able to keep Tony's teaching on this station. So if you get in touch with us and make your contribution right away, we'd like to send you all 10 full-length CDs in our current series, The Eternal Perspective, as our thank you gift. Contact us today to make your contribution and request your copy of The Eternal Perspective before this special offer runs out. Just visit tonyevans.org or give us a phone call day or night at 1-800-800-3222. That's 1-800-800-3222. Well, right now, here's Dr. Evans with more of today's message.
Then he says, well, let me help you out a little bit more, disciples. Consider the ravens. Consider the ravens. Mother Nature comes from Father God. And when Father God created Mother Nature, he placed in Mother Nature lessons for us to live by. He says one of those lessons is the raven. So let me ask you a question. When's the last time you studied a raven to learn theology? You probably haven't looked at a raven and said, God, what are you teaching me from the raven? He says nature has been put here to teach you some very substantive lessons about not worrying. Please notice he doesn't say look at the birds. He says look at the ravens. He picks a certain kind of bird. Why that bird? Because the raven was an unclean bird. The Jews could not eat the ravens. The ravens in the Old Testament were unclean. So Jesus picks a bird that you wouldn't fool with anyway if you were Jewish, because he's speaking to his Jewish disciples. He says, consider the birds you would never consider. He says, let me tell you about this bird. They neither sow nor reap. They don't have farms, they don't have seeds, they don't plant. Neither do they, like the rich man, have a storehouse that they're building. They don't have barns, yet God feeds them. Wait a minute now. The ravens eat because God feeds them. But wait a minute, how does God feed a raven? You don't see a raven standing on a branch with his mouth open, waiting for worms to drop from heaven. That's not how they eat. They go find worms, but the beauty of how God feeds them is he builds into creation that which empowers their existence. God has already put into the way nature works the food for the unclean, the ravens, is built into creation. And then he says, are you not much more valuable than they? Wait a minute. If I will feed an unclean bird in my creation, and you're my child and my follower, if I value something that I call unclean and make sure there are plenty of worms to go around, and you are my child, do you think I have less concern for you than them? So let me repeat this again to remind me and to remind you. Because if you ever get this in your gizzard, that means way deep down in your soul. If it ever settles in your gizzard, in your gut, so that it becomes a way of thinking, functioning, and operating. The lesson you learn from the ravens that he's applying to his disciples, you and me, is that the ravens understand that when it comes to eating, God is their source. It is so hard to get this in the minds of God's children. You only have one source. You do not have many sources. You have many resources, many mechanisms that God uses. If a raven can't find a worm over here, it's going to go over there, because a raven, an unclean bird, understands that God has sufficiently provided so that there is a locatable worm somewhere. They understand that. So a raven over here, when it does not find a worm, does not get an ulcer. It does not need to go to Walgreens to get an Excedrin PM aspirin. It doesn't get all shook up because the unclean bird assumes something. That the Creator God, that doesn't even value it like a human being, has got enough worms to go around. When you and I do not understand what the ravens understand, we get all shook up when there is no provision over here, there is no resource working over here, because we did not have the eternal perspective that understood that God is not limited by the only resource you are aware of. One of the fun things I get to do and love to do, because it helps me, but it also seeks to help the person who's talking to me, is when they come to me when a resource has failed. I had a brother, he was in the first service. He called me this week to tell me that they downsized his company and he was laid off. His resource failed him. He's got a family. What is he to do, since that was the place where he was looking to do what he should do as a husband and father? And one of the joys, I just love doing this, is to say that that resource was not the source, And your source has many resource options available to him. So don't you worry that a resource failed when, as long as you are plugged into the source who has multiple resources, you are not limited to the failure of no worms in that job anymore. But without a heavenly perspective, when that one resource seems to bail out on you, when the worms in this location are no longer findable, but because you have gotten rich in heaven, you are operating with an eternal perspective. All God has to do is shift locations to a new resource. He says, study the ravens. Don't just watch them fly, exegete them. Do an exposition of them, because if you study them, you will not see them fussing, cussing, or complaining. They're not losing it. And even though you're more valuable, they may understand it better. The ravens, they don't have CDs, mutual funds, or 401ks. But they do have a source, and that source covers them. And are you not more valuable than they are? Which of you, verse 25, by worrying can add a single hour to your lifespan? He says every time you worry, you waste your time. You do not add to your life, you may be contributing to shortening it. He says, consider, study the lilies of the field, the beautiful flowers. How they grow, they neither toil nor spin. They have never taken a sewing class. The beautiful flowers have never gone to buy cloth or have never gone to a paint shop to give them their brilliant color. But I tell you, not even Solomon in all of his glory clothed himself like one of these. And that is the God who is responsible for you.
Dr. Evans will come back in a moment with a great illustration to wrap up today's lesson called The Reassurance of a Heavenly Perspective. In the meantime, if you'd like to add it to your home or church library, you can request it on CD or DVD. But it's also included as a part of Tony's current series, The Eternal Perspective. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll send you all 10 full-length CDs in this collection as our thank you gift when you help keep Tony's teaching on this station with a contribution of any amount, large or small. Visit tonyevans.org today and make the arrangements before this special offer runs out. That's tonyevans.org, where you can find information on all of our resources and sign up for Tony's free weekly email devotional. Again, that's tonyevans.org. Or give us a phone call day or night at 1-800-800-3222. That's 1-800-800-3222. Well, tomorrow, more from Dr. Evans about how a heavenly perspective can become the antidote to your earthly worries. Right now, though, he's back with his final thought for today.
He says in verse 34, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Now, let me tell you how most people misread that. They misread that to say where your heart is, your treasure will be. That's backwards. It says where your treasure is, your heart will be. Translation, your heart follows your treasure. An eternal perspective, being rich toward God, making the eternal greater than the temporal, making the spiritual greater than the physical, positions you to experience the sourcing of God at a level that will blow your mind and lift your worry.
The Alternative with Dr. Tony Evans is brought to you by the Urban Alternative and is made possible by the generous contributions of listeners like you.